In the beginning, long before the might of legions marched across continents and emperors ruled a world-spanning empire, Rome existed only as a legend whispered through the ages. The story begins not with marble forums or triumphal arches, but with a tale of God's destiny and the survival of twin brothers abandoned on the banks of the river Tiber. According to myth, the origins of Rome stretch back to the fall of another great city, Troy. When Troy was consumed by flames, Aeneas, a Trojan prince, fled across the seas, guided by fate and the will of the gods. His wanderings, immortalized in the Roman imagination, brought him to the shores of Italy. There, amid struggles and alliances, his descendants would one day give birth to a city destined for greatness. Generations later, twin brothers Romulus and Remus came into the world, born of a mortal woman, Rhea Silvia, and the god of war, Mars. Their very blood carried the promise of conflict and conquest. But from the moment of their birth they were condemned. An uncle, fearful of rivals to his power, ordered the infants drowned in the Tiber. Yet fate intervened. The river carried them safely to the roots of a wild fig tree, where a she-wolf, fierce yet nurturing, nursed the boys as her own. Later a shepherd took them in, raising them with the rugged strength of the countryside. As they grew, their true destiny became clear. Romulus and Remus dreamed of founding a city, a permanent settlement upon the 7 hills that rose beside the Tiber. But ambition is a dangerous companion, and in the heat of rivalry, blood was spilled. The brothers quarreled over where the city should rise, over who would rule it, and in the end, Romulus struck his brother down. Standing over the body of Remus, he declared himself the founder and gave his own name to the city, Roma. From the moment of its birth in 753 BC, Rome was marked by violence, ambition, and the struggle for supremacy. In the early years, Rome was little more than a cluster of huts, a village perched on the Palatine Hill. Its people were shepherds and farmers living off the land, eking out survival on the fringes of larger, older civilizations like the Etruscans to the north and the Latins around them. Yet even in these humble beginnings, Rome's hunger was evident. Romulus himself established the first institutions of the city, a senate of 100 elders, a system of warriors, and the boundaries of civic order. But Rome needed more than laws. It needed people. Legend tells us that Romulus solved this problem with cunning audacity. He opened the city to outcasts, fugitives, and wanderers, declaring Rome a sanctuary for all. Thieves, exiles, adventurers, and broken men from every corner came to fill its streets. A city of cast-offs was forged into a community. But these men lacked wives, and so the Romans turned to the neighboring Sabines. At a festival, the Romans carried off the Sabine women, igniting war. Yet when peace was made, the women themselves stood as mediators, binding their fathers and husbands together. Out of conflict was born unity, and Rome absorbed the Sabines into its growing population. Romulus reigned as the first king of Rome until his mysterious death. Some claimed he was torn apart by senators in rage, others that he was lifted to the heavens, becoming the god Quirinus. His reign set the tone. Rome would be built on ambition, war, and the absorption of others into its ever-growing fold. The kings who followed each left their mark. Numa Pompilius, the second king, brought peace and religion, crafting Rome's sacred rites and rituals. He gave the city its spiritual foundation, establishing temples and priesthoods, ensuring Rome was not only strong in arms, but anchored in divine order. After him came Tullus Hostilius, who reignited Rome's martial spirit. Under his rule, the conflict with Alba Longa, the mother city of the Latins, gave rise to the famous duel of the Hieraci and Curiati, where 3 brothers fought 3 brothers to decide the fate of nations. Victory secured Rome's dominance, but arrogance brought disaster. Tullus ignored the gods, and when plague struck, he sought their favor too late. A bolt of lightning ended his reign. The 4th king, Ancus Marcius, turned Rome's eyes outward, building bridges across the Tiber and establishing the port of Ostia, at the mouth of the river. For the first time, Rome reached beyond its hills to the sea, planting the seeds of trade and expansion. Yet it was with the arrival of the Tarquin dynasty that Rome began to truly transform. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, known as Tarquin the Elder, was an Etruscan by birth, and with him came the influence of Etruscan culture. He doubled the size of the Senate, initiated massive building projects, and laid the foundations of the great Roman Forum. He is credited with beginning the construction of the Circus Maximus, the massive chariot racing stadium that would thrill generations. Yet power in Rome was never secure. Tarquin was assassinated, and his widow Tanaquil maneuvered to secure the throne for their protege, Servius Tullius. Servius Tullius, once a slave, rose to become one of Rome's greatest kings. He reorganized Roman society, introducing the census, dividing citizens into classes by wealth, and creating the framework for the legions that would one day conquer the world. He expanded the city across its hills and surrounded it with the first Great Wall, the Servian Wall. But power, again, brought betrayal. Tarquin the Proud, son of the elder Tarquin, seized the throne by violence, murdering Servius and casting his body down the steps of the Senate House. Tarquin the Proud lived up to his name. Arrogant, ruthless, and ambitious, he ruled with tyranny. He completed great works, including the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, but his cruelty and disdain for the Senate poisoned his reign. The breaking point came not from his governance alone, but from a crime that outraged the entire Roman people. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, assaulted Lucretia, a noblewoman renowned for her virtue. Shamed and dishonored, Lucretia took her own life, but not before demanding vengeance. Her death ignited fury, and led by Lucius Junius Brutus, the people of Rome rose up against the Tarquins. The monarchy was overthrown, and with it, the line of kings came to an end. In 509 BC, Rome declared itself a republic. Power would no longer rest in the hands of one king, but would be shared between elected magistrates, guided by the Senate, and accountable to the people. The republic was born in blood, as Rome vowed never again to be ruled by a tyrant. The expulsion of the Tarquins did not merely end a dynasty. It marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter in history. And yet, as Rome cast off its kings, it stood at the threshold of uncertainty. Surrounded by rivals, threatened by the Etruscans to the north and Latin cities to the south, the young republic would have to prove itself in war and in governance. What had begun as a story of gods and shepherds, of twin brothers and exiled kings, was about to become something far greater, the story of how a single city on the Tiber would rise to command the known world. When the Tarquin kings were cast out and the Republic declared, Rome was a city standing at a crossroads. It had broken the chains of monarchy, yet in doing so, it had also made powerful enemies. The exiled Tarquins appealed to their allies, and the young Republic soon found itself in a fight for survival. It was as if the gods themselves tested whether this experiment in shared rule could endure. At the heart of the new system were two consuls, elected annually, each holding equal power, each meant to check the other. Around them stood the Senate, the council of elders that had advised kings for centuries but now claimed new authority. And behind it all were the Roman people, assembled in tribes and centuries, their voices echoing in votes and debates. Yet the Republic was not a democracy, as we might imagine. Power remained in the hands of the patricians, the aristocratic families whose wealth and lineage placed them above the common people. Still, the plebeians, the mass of ordinary Romans, would not remain silent forever. The Republic's early years were marked by war. Almost immediately, Tarquin the Proud sought aid from Lars Porsena, king of Clusium, an Etruscan power. Porsena marched upon Rome, laying siege to its walls. Here the legends of Roman courage first took shape. Horatius Cocles, standing at the bridge across the Tiber, held back the Etruscan army while his comrades destroyed the span behind him. Alone, against countless foes, he stood as the embodiment of Roman valor. When the bridge collapsed, he leapt into the river and swam to safety, becoming a symbol of the Republic's unyielding spirit. Though Rome endured, its survival was precarious. The Latin League, once allies, turned hostile, and the Republic fought to assert dominance. The Battle of Lake Regillus became a defining moment. Roman forces, led by the dictator Aulus Postumius, clashed with the Latins, and according to legend, the divine twins Castor and Pollux appeared on horseback, fighting at Rome's side. Victory secured Roman primacy among the Latin cities, though it would take generations of diplomacy and war to weave them firmly into Rome's sphere. As Rome battled abroad, it also wrestled with strife within. The plebeians, excluded from real power and burdened by debt, began what history remembers as the struggle of the orders. When their demands went unheard, they withdrew en masse from the city, retreating to the Sacred Mount in 494 BC. Rome ground to a halt, its survival threatened not by foreign swords but by the absence of its own people. It was then that compromise was struck. The plebeians would have their own magistrates, the tribunes of the people, sacrosanct officials empowered to protect them and to veto actions that harmed their interests. This was the beginning of a long, slow balancing of power. As plebeians pressed for rights and patricians resisted, each concession hard-won, each reform shaping the republic into something new. The wars continued. Rome's neighbors tested it repeatedly. The Etruscans to the north, the Volsci and Aequi to the east, the Sabines to the center, all sought to humble the republic. Yet Rome's strength lay not only in its soldiers, but in its resilience. When defeated, it refused to yield. When victorious, it did not simply destroy, but absorbed. Town by town, tribe by tribe, Rome extended its influence, binding allies through treaties, exacting loyalty while granting just enough autonomy to keep them bound to the Roman cause. This system of alliances, the socii, became the backbone of Roman power. But fate had not finished testing Rome. In 390 BC, disaster struck. The Gauls, fierce warriors from beyond the Alps, swept down into Italy. At the river Allia, the Roman army was shattered, and the victors marched upon the city itself. Rome burned. Only the Capitoline Hill held out, defended by a handful of citizens and sacred geese, whose cries, according to legend, warned of a night assault. When the Gauls departed at last, bribed with gold, Rome lay in ruins. Many thought the city finished. Yet from the ashes, Rome rebuilt, stronger than before. They swore never again to be caught unprepared, and from this vow came a renewed discipline and determination. The trauma of the Gallic sack lingered for centuries, a scar that drove Rome's relentless pursuit of security through conquest. In the decades that followed, Rome turned its attention southward. The Samnites, a hardy mountain people, became their greatest challenge. The Samnite Wars stretched over half a century, marked by triumphs and humiliations alike. In the Caudine Forks, a narrow mountain pass, Roman legions were trapped and forced to pass under the yoke, a symbol of utter defeat. Yet Rome learned from its losses, adapting, innovating, and returning to the field with greater strength. By the war's end, Rome stood as the dominant power of central Italy. During these struggles, Rome refined the military machine that would one day conquer the Mediterranean. The manipular legion replaced the rigid phalanx, dividing soldiers into smaller, flexible units that could adapt to rough terrain and shifting battle lines. Discipline, training, and the unyielding will to endure gave Roman armies an edge over their foes. And with each victory, Rome expanded its network of colonies and allies, planting Roman citizens in new territories, building roads to bind the land together, and weaving Italy into the fabric of Roman power. But no story of the Republic's early centuries would be complete without returning to the conflict between patricians and plebeians. Over time, the plebeians pressed for greater equality, and slowly, concessions were made. The 12 Tables, Rome's first written laws, were inscribed for all to see, ensuring that justice could no longer be manipulated solely by the aristocracy. Later, plebeians gained the right to hold the consulship, to marry into patrician families, to sit in the highest councils of state. The republic was transformed from within, each reform a step toward unity, each struggle a reminder that Rome's strength lay in the balance between its classes. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome had extended its authority across the Italian peninsula. The final struggle came against Pyrrhus of Epirus, a Greek king and brilliant general who crossed the sea to defend the Greek cities of southern Italy against Roman encroachment. With his war elephants and Macedonian phalanx, Pyrrhus won great victories, yet each came at staggering cost. Another such victory he is said to have remarked, "And I am undone." Pyrrhic victories could not sustain him, and at last he withdrew, leaving Rome triumphant. With the defeat of Pyrrhus and the submission of the Greek cities, Rome's conquest of Italy was complete. From humble beginnings as a village of shepherds, from the fiery trial of monarchy and exile, from the ashes of the Gallic sack, Rome had risen to command the entire peninsula. It had forged alliances, refined its armies, and created a political system that, though imperfect, allowed for resilience and adaptation. The stage was now set for a far greater struggle. Beyond the seas to the west lay Carthage, mistress of the western Mediterranean, wealthy and powerful. The clash between Rome and Carthage would determine not merely the fate of Italy, but of the entire ancient world. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, Rome had mastered the Italian peninsula. Its legions disciplined and relentless, its alliances carefully bound by loyalty and obligation, had made it the dominant power of the land. Yet across the sea, another giant awaited. Carthage, the great Phoenician city of North Africa, ruled the waves. Its harbors brimmed with merchant ships, its coffers with silver and gold, its admirals commanding fleets that touched Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily. For 2 centuries, Rome and Carthage had lived side by side, cautious, respectful, each avoiding direct confrontation. But the world was not big enough for both to reign supreme. The spark would come in Sicily, the jewel at the center of the Mediterranean. Sicily was a land of rich fields and prosperous Greek colonies, but also a crossroads of conflict. When war broke out between local powers, both Rome and Carthage were drawn in, each unwilling to let the other seize control of the island. In 264 BC, Rome sent legions across the strait, and the First Punic War began. It was unlike any conflict Rome had ever faced. Carthage's strength lay at sea, while Rome was a land power, untested on the waves. Carthage's triremes and quinqueremes seemed unstoppable, their skilled sailors cutting through the waters with ease. But Rome was nothing if not adaptable. Capturing a Carthaginian warship, Roman engineers studied it, copied it, and built a fleet of their own. Lacking experience, they added a new invention, the corvus, a boarding bridge that turned naval battles into land battles at sea. When the ships met, Roman soldiers stormed across the bridges, seizing enemy decks with the same discipline they showed on land. Victory followed. At Mylae, at Ecnomus, the Carthaginian fleets were driven back. Yet the war dragged on for more than 2 decades, a grinding contest of endurance. Carthage struck back fiercely, sending Hamilcar Barca, a brilliant general, to harass Roman forces. But Rome would not yield. After years of stalemate, the consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus led a rebuilt fleet to victory at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC. Carthage, exhausted and bankrupt, sued for peace. Rome emerged victorious, claiming Sicily as its first overseas province. The Republic, once confined to Italy, now reached across the sea. But peace was an illusion. Carthage, though humbled, remained a formidable power. While Rome extended its grasp to Sardinia and Corsica, Carthage turned to Spain, where Hamilcar Barca carved out a new empire of silver mines and fertile lands. His son Hannibal grew up amid these campaigns, taught to hate Rome from childhood. Legend holds that Hamilcar made the boy swear an oath before the gods that he would never be a friend to Rome. Hannibal would keep that oath, and in doing so, nearly bring the Republic to ruin. In 218 BC, war broke out again, and this time Hannibal struck first. With audacity unmatched in history, he led his army, war elephants included, across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and over the frozen Alps into Italy itself. The journey was a nightmare of snow, rock slides, and hostile tribes. Thousands perished, but Hannibal emerged on the other side with an army still formidable enough to shake Rome to its core. The Italian campaigns that followed became legendary. At the Trebia, Hannibal lured the Romans into icy waters and crushed them. At Lake Trasimene, he ambushed their columns in a fog-shrouded pass, slaughtering tens of thousands. Then came Cannae in 216 BC, perhaps the most devastating defeat in Roman history. Facing a massive Roman army, Hannibal arranged his troops in a crescent, drawing the enemy in before enveloping them on all sides. The Roman legions were annihilated, their blood soaking the fields of Apulia. Rome trembled, allies wavered, cities defected, and the Republic's survival seemed uncertain. Yet here lay Rome's greatest strength, its refusal to surrender. Even after Cannae, when any other power might have sought terms, Rome declared it would never negotiate with Hannibal. Consul after consul raised new armies, and though Hannibal ravaged Italy for more than a decade, he could not break Rome's will. Instead, Rome turned to a strategy of attrition, avoiding pitched battles, harassing Hannibal, and cutting off his supply lines. Meanwhile, a new Roman commander rose in Spain, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. Brilliant and daring, he drove Carthaginian forces from Spain, severing Hannibal from his base of power. Then in 204 BC, Scipio carried the war to Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal home. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, the two titans met. Hannibal, master of strategy, faced Scipio, the student who had learned from his every move. Elephants charged, but Scipio's legions opened lanes, turning chaos into order. The Roman cavalry, commanded by Massinissa of Numidia, swept in from the flanks. Hannibal's army broke, and Carthage's fate was sealed. The Second Punic War ended with Rome supreme. The terms were harsh. Carthage was stripped of its fleet, its empire, and its freedom to wage war. Rome now dominated not only Italy but Spain, the Western Mediterranean, and beyond. Yet even this was not the end. For half a century, Carthage endured, rebuilding its wealth, reviving its prosperity. But in Rome, voices like Cato the Elder thundered in the Senate, repeating a single phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome acted. The Third Punic War began, and this time there would be no mercy. For 3 years, Carthage resisted with desperate courage. At last, in 146 BC, Roman legions stormed the city, led by Scipio Aemilianus, grandson of the great Africanus. Street by street, house by house, Carthage burned. When the final flames died, the once great city lay in ruins, its people enslaved, its walls torn down. In that same year, Rome also destroyed Corinth, the jewel of Greece, crushing the last great resistance in the East. The message was clear. Rome was now the unrivaled master of the Mediterranean. The Republic had triumphed, but in doing so it had unleashed forces that would reshape it forever. The wealth of empire poured into Rome, corrupting old traditions, widening the gulf between rich and poor, and feeding ambitions that would soon tear the Republic apart from within. The Punic Wars had ended, but the struggle for Rome's soul was only beginning. Rome stood victorious. Carthage lay in ashes, Corinth lay in ruins, and the Mediterranean had become what the Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Never before had a city risen so high, so fast, yet beneath the triumphs, beneath the marble temples and glittering spoils paraded through the streets, cracks began to spread through the very foundations of the Republic. For victory brought wealth, and wealth brought corruption. The spoils of empire flowed into the hands of the elite, while the common citizen, the soldier, and farmer who had borne the burden of conquest found himself left behind. The old agrarian republic, where citizen farmers tilled their plots and fought for the state, was dying. Vast estates, called latifundia, spread across the countryside, worked by slaves taken in war. Small farmers, unable to compete, sold their land and drifted into the city, where they crowded into insulae, towering tenements that swelled the population of Rome. The gap between rich and poor widened, and with it grew unrest. It was into this world that the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus stepped, tribunes of the people whose names would echo through history. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus sought to revive the old republic by redistributing land to the poor, restoring dignity to the citizen farmer. But his reforms threatened the Senate's interests, and violence erupted. In a shocking breach of tradition, Tiberius was clubbed to death by senators and their followers, his body left in the street. 10 years later, his brother Gaius renewed the struggle, pushing for broader reforms, even extending rights to Rome's Italian allies. He too met a bloody end, hunted down and killed on the Aventine Hill. The Gracchi had fallen, but they had set a precedent. Reform in Rome would be met not with debate but with blood. As the century wore on, the Republic found itself caught in a spiral of violence. Ambitious generals rose, fueled by loyalty not to the state, but to their armies. Gaius Marius, a man of humble origins, reformed the legions, opening service to the landless poor. His soldiers were no longer tied to farms, but to him personally, dependent on their commander for land and plunder. Rome's legions had become tools of political power. Marius's military genius saved Rome from northern invaders, the Cimbri and Teutones, whose migrations had threatened to overwhelm Italy. His victories won him unprecedented popularity, but also set him on a collision course with another ambitious general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Their rivalry erupted into open civil war, shattering the Republic's traditions. For the first time, Roman legions marched on Rome itself, as citizens slaughtered citizens in the streets. Sulla emerged victorious, seizing power as dictator. His reign was marked by proscriptions, lists of enemies posted publicly, men declared outlaws whose deaths were rewarded, their property seized. Rome had entered a new era, where politics was decided not in the Senate but at the edge of the sword. Though Sulla resigned his dictatorship and restored the Republic in name, the precedent could not be undone. Ambition had learned a new path, and Rome's greatest men were no longer content with office. They sought absolute power. In the shadow of Sulla's legacy rose figures destined to shape the Republic's final days. Pompey the Great, a brilliant general who secured victories in Spain and crushed the pirates who plagued the Mediterranean, returned to Rome hailed as a new Alexander. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, wielded his fortune like a weapon, financing armies and buying influence. Together with Pompey, he crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus, whose rebellion had shaken the Republic to its core. Spartacus, a gladiator who led tens of thousands of slaves in a desperate fight for freedom, had terrified Rome. His defeat was brutal. 6,000 captives crucified along the Appian Way, a grim reminder of the Republic's ruthlessness. It was into this world of ambition and blood that a new star rose, Gaius Julius Caesar. Young, eloquent, and daring, Caesar bound himself to Pompey and Crassus in what became known as the First Triumvirate, an informal alliance that dominated Roman politics. With Pompey's military prestige, Crassus's wealth, and Caesar's political cunning, they bent the Republic to their will. Caesar was granted command in Gaul, where he embarked on a campaign of conquest that would make his name immortal. For nearly a decade, Caesar waged war in Gaul, crushing tribes, forging alliances, and even crossing the sea to Britain. His commentaries, written in clear, simple prose, reported not only his victories but his vision of destiny. By the time he returned, he commanded a battle-hardened army and the loyalty of legions that looked to him above all others. But in Rome, alliances had fractured. Crassus was dead, slain in a disastrous campaign against the Parthians, and Pompey, once Caesar's ally, now aligned himself with the Senate against him. In 49 BC, the Senate, fearful of Caesar's power, demanded he lay down his command. Instead, he crossed the Rubicon River with a single legion, declaring war not only on Pompey but on the Republic itself. "The die is cast," he is said to have declared, as his soldiers marched south. Civil war had returned. The conflict was swift and decisive. Pompey fled to Greece, where Caesar pursued him. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar's smaller force overwhelmed Pompey's legions. Pompey fled to Egypt, only to be betrayed and murdered upon arrival. When Caesar himself landed in Alexandria, he found not only Pompey's severed head but also the intrigues of the Ptolemaic court. There he encountered Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, with whom he forged both an alliance and a legendary romance. Returning to Rome, Caesar was hailed as dictator, yet even as he consolidated power, he cloaked his rule in the trappings of the Republic. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian system that endures in modified form today. He expanded citizenship, restructured debts, and centralized authority. But to his enemies, he was a king in all but name, a tyrant threatening the Republic's last breath. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, as Caesar entered the Senate, a group of conspirators struck. Led by Brutus and Cassius, men who saw themselves as liberators, they stabbed him 23 times, spilling his blood at the feet of Pompey's statue. Et tu, Brute? Whether spoken or imagined, those words came to embody the tragedy of betrayal. Caesar fell, and with him, the Republic entered its death throes. But Caesar's death did not restore liberty. Instead, it plunged Rome into chaos once more. His allies and heirs vied for power, chief among them Marcus Antonius, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, and Octavian, his adopted son and heir. Together they hunted the assassins, defeating Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi. Yet their alliance, known as the Second Triumvirate, soon fractured. Octavian and Antony turned against one another, the world's greatest empire divided between East and West. Antony, bound to Cleopatra in love and ambition, sought to build a new dynasty from Alexandria. Octavian, patient and calculating, painted him as a traitor to Rome, enthralled by an Eastern queen. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's fleet triumphed. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, facing defeat, they took their own lives. With their deaths, Octavian stood alone. The Republic, torn apart by a century of civil wars, by the ambitions of generals and the blood of citizens, lay in ruins. Yet from its ashes arose something new. Octavian, careful not to call himself king, took the title Princeps, the first citizen. He cloaked his power in republican forms, but in truth he held supreme authority. In 27 BC, the Senate granted him the name Augustus, and with it, the Roman Empire was born. The Republic had died, consumed by its own contradictions, but the dream of Rome endured. What began as a city of shepherds, what fought to survive Kings Gauls and Hannibal, what tore itself apart in civil strife, had now forged a new order, one that would stand as the greatest empire the world had ever known. The death of the Republic brought not chaos but order. For Octavian, now Augustus, was a master of illusion. He wrapped his absolute power in the faded garments of republican tradition. He spoke of restoring the old ways, of giving authority back to the Senate, but in truth every lever of power lay in his hands. The legions swore loyalty not to the Senate, nor to Rome itself, but to him. The treasury, the provinces, the laws, all bent beneath his quiet authority. Yet Augustus was no tyrant in the mold of Caesar. He was cautious, deliberate, a man who understood that power endured only when cloaked in legitimacy. And so he became the Princeps, the first citizen, presenting himself not as a king but as the servant of the state. Under Augustus, Rome entered an age of transformation. The city itself was remade. He found it, as he boasted, a city of brick, and left it one of marble. Temples rose to Jupiter, Apollo, and Mars' altar, the Avenger. The Ara Pacis, the altar of peace, stood as a monument to his reign. Roads stretched outward from Rome like veins of stone, carrying legions, merchants, and ideas across an empire that now spanned from Spain to Syria, from the sands of Africa to the forests of Gaul. Yet Augustus understood that Rome's strength was not only in its arms but in stability. He reorganized the provinces, appointing governors loyal to him. He professionalized the army, creating a standing force with fixed terms of service, and he established the Praetorian Guard, his personal protectors. He reformed taxes, secured grain supplies, and patronized literature and the arts. Under his rule, Virgil composed the Aeneid, Rome's great national epic, linking the destiny of Rome to the hero Aeneas and the gods themselves. But Augustus's reign was not without shadow. He banished his own daughter Julia for scandal, sacrificed personal happiness for the appearance of moral reform, and waged ruthless wars on the frontiers. In Germania, disaster struck. In AD 9, 3 Roman legions under Varus were annihilated in the Teutoburg forest, ambushed by Germanic tribes led by Arminius. The loss scarred Augustus deeply. "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions," he is said to have cried. From that moment, Rome abandoned dreams of conquering beyond the Rhine. When Augustus died in AD 14, he left behind not merely an empire but a system, a blueprint for imperial rule that would endure for centuries. His stepson Tiberius succeeded him, continuing the fragile balance of monarchy disguised as republic. Tiberius was capable, cautious, yet darkly suspicious, retreating into isolation, while his prefect Sejanus sowed terror in the capital. He left the throne to Caligula, whose madness and cruelty turned Rome's golden age into a spectacle of horror. Caligula proclaimed himself a living god, paraded in costumes of deities, and humiliated senators. He squandered fortunes, built pleasure palaces, and according to some accounts named his horse as consul. His reign ended in blood, assassinated by his own guards. The empire passed to Claudius, overlooked by many, but wiser than he appeared. Though mocked for his stammer and limp, Claudius proved an able administrator. He expanded the empire, conquering Britain, and strengthened the bureaucracy that held Rome together. But his household was plagued by intrigue. His wife Agrippina maneuvered her son Nero into succession, and Claudius himself fell, poisoned by those closest to him. Nero began with promise, guided by tutors like Seneca, but soon descended into tyranny. Obsessed with performance, Nero fancied himself a musician and actor, forcing Rome's elites to watch his endless recitals. His extravagance drained the treasury, while suspicion drove him to murder his own mother. In AD 64, fire consumed much of Rome. Though Nero sought to blame the Christians, the first great persecution of that new faith, rumors spread that he himself had ordered the blaze. "Rome burns while Nero fiddles," the people whispered, though the fiddle itself had yet to exist. Rebellion followed, and in AD 68, abandoned by his guards, Nero took his own life. With his death, the line of Augustus ended, and Rome fell into chaos. The year of the 4 emperors saw generals across the empire vying for power. Galba, Otho, and Vitellius rose and fell in quick succession, until Vespasian, commander in the east, seized control. With him began the Flavian dynasty, restoring order to the empire. Vespasian was practical, frugal, a man of discipline who rebuilt Rome's finances and began the construction of the Colosseum, that grand amphitheater where gladiators, wild beasts, and spectacles of blood entertained the masses. His sons, Titus and Domitian, carried on his legacy. Titus brought both triumph and tragedy: the eruption of Vesuvius in AD 79, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum, and the opening of the Colosseum with games that lasted 100 days. Domitian, though efficient, ruled with paranoia and cruelty until he too was struck down. The century that followed, however, became known as Rome's Golden Age, the era of the 5 good emperors. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius brought stability, prosperity, and expansion. Under Trajan, Rome reached its greatest extent, stretching to the Persian Gulf, embracing Dacia, Arabia, and beyond. His conquests filled the coffers, and his triumphal column still tells the tale of his victories. Hadrian, his successor, turned from conquest to consolidation. He traveled the empire, strengthening its borders, building walls in Britain to mark the limits of Roman reach, beautifying cities, and fostering a sense of unity across vast lands. His reign was one of culture as much as power, his love of Greek art and philosophy shaping Rome's intellectual life. Antoninus Pius presided over decades of peace, a steady hand that preserved the empire's prosperity. And Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, wrote his meditations in the quiet of his tent, seeking wisdom and virtue even as he waged war on the northern frontiers. Yet even he could not shield Rome from turmoil. The empire faced invasions, plague, and unrest, challenges that foreshadowed the storms to come. When Marcus died in AD 180, he left the throne to his son Commodus, and with him, the Golden Age ended. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had lasted 2 centuries. Roads, aqueducts, laws, and legions had bound the Mediterranean into a single world. Commerce flowed freely, cities thrived, cultures mingled, and Roman citizenship spread to millions. It was an age of marble and literature, of order and prosperity unmatched in history. Yet beneath the surface, new tensions stirred. The empire had grown vast, perhaps too vast, its borders stretched thin, its stability dependent on the wisdom of emperors. And emperors, as history would soon reveal, could be as dangerous to Rome as her enemies beyond the frontiers. The glory of Augustus and the wisdom of the 5 good emperors had given Rome her zenith. But in the centuries that followed, the empire would be tested as never before, as civil war, invasion, and faith would transform it beyond recognition. The death of Marcus Aurelius in AD 180 marked not only the end of the Pax Romana, but the beginning of an age of decline. For the first time in generations, the empire passed to an heir born not of merit, but of blood. Commodus, son of the philosopher emperor, was the antithesis of his father. Vain, reckless, and intoxicated by power. He fancied himself a gladiator, appearing in the arena to slay wild beasts and mock opponents, scandalizing Rome's elites. He renamed the months after his own titles, erected statues portraying himself as Hercules, and ruled through cruelty and whim. His reign brought corruption, instability, and a growing sense that the empire's destiny had shifted. In 192, Commodus was assassinated, strangled in his bath, and with his death the Antonine dynasty ended. The year that followed was one of civil war and chaos. In the year of the 5 emperors, generals and pretenders rose and fell as Rome's legions proclaimed their own candidates. At last, Septimius Severus emerged victorious. He was a man of stern discipline, born in North Africa, who strengthened the army's loyalty with pay and privileges. Under him, the Severan dynasty sought to restore order, but it did so at a cost. The empire became more militarized. The Senate diminished to a ceremonial body, while the Praetorian Guard and the legions determined the fate of emperors. Severus himself warned his sons on his deathbed, "Enrich the soldiers, scorn all others." It was advice that revealed the new reality of Rome, that power rested not in tradition or civic virtue, but in the loyalty of armed men. His sons, Caracalla and Geta, inherited the throne together, but their rivalry was deadly. Within months, Caracalla murdered his brother in their mother's arms, consolidating power with blood. Ruthless and ambitious, Caracalla expanded citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, a sweeping gesture that bound millions more to Rome, but also broadened the tax base. Yet his reign was marked by brutality, and in 217, he too was cut down by a soldier's blade. The Severan dynasty lingered on through intrigue and weakness, but the empire itself was unraveling. Invasions pressed at the borders, Germanic tribes across the Rhine and Danube, Persians in the east under the new Sasanian dynasty. The old balance of power that had kept Rome secure was shifting. In 260, Emperor Valerian marched against the Persians, only to suffer one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history. Captured alive by Shapur I, King of Kings, Valerian was paraded in chains, used as a human footstool, and eventually died in captivity. His skin, it was said, was flayed and stuffed with straw as a trophy of Persia's triumph. Rome's humiliation did not end there. Across the empire, usurpers rose, provinces broke away, and the unity of Rome splintered. In Gaul, a separate Gallic empire emerged under Postumus, ruling over Gaul, Spain, and Britain. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra carved out her own dominion, stretching from Egypt to Asia Minor. The Central Empire, battered by invasion, plague, and famine, seemed on the verge of collapse. This period, known as the Crisis of the 3rd Century, revealed the empire's fragility. The economy faltered as coinage was debased, inflation soared, and trade networks crumbled. Cities shrank, farmland was abandoned, and plague decimated populations. Armies were raised and disbanded in quick succession, their loyalty shifting with the promise of donatives. In little more than 50 years, Rome saw over 20 emperors rise and fall, most slain by their own soldiers. Stability seemed a distant memory, the dream of Augustus and Trajan buried beneath chaos. And yet, amid the storm, there were glimmers of resilience. Emperors like Gallienus fought desperately to preserve what remained, reforming the cavalry into a more mobile, professional force. Aurelian, rising in 270, proved to be the empire's savior. Known as Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world, Aurelian defeated the Goths, crushed the Gallic Empire, and brought Zenobia of Palmyra in chains to Rome. For a moment, unity was restored. Aurelian even began building massive walls around Rome itself, a recognition that the eternal city was no longer invulnerable. But like so many before him, Aurelian fell to betrayal, murdered by his own officers in 275. Still, the tide was shifting. By the end of the 3rd century, the empire had been battered but not destroyed. It had adapted, hardened, transformed into something new. The age of senatorial influence and republican nostalgia was long gone. Rome was now an empire of soldiers, forged in crisis, ruled by emperors who rose by the sword and fell by the sword. In 284, a new figure stepped onto the stage, Diocles, a soldier from Illyria who rose from humble origins to seize the purple. As Diocletian, he would reshape the empire more radically than any ruler since Augustus, ending the chaos of the 3rd century and setting Rome on a path toward survival in a changed world. But his reforms would come at a price, binding the empire together with iron chains, and in doing so, laying the foundations for a new age. The age of division, Christianity, and the long transformation of Rome into something both ancient and yet entirely new. When Diocletian seized power in 284, the empire was weary, scarred by 50 years of chaos. He was a soldier emperor, hardened by frontier wars, yet he understood that the crisis Rome faced could not be solved by the sword alone. The empire had grown too vast, too complex for one man to rule. And so he devised a radical solution: the Tetrarchy. Under this system, power was divided between 4 rulers. Diocletian took the east, the wealthier half of the empire, with Nicomedia as his capital. His trusted colleague Maximian ruled the west from Milan. Beneath them, 2 junior emperors, Galerius and Constantius Chlorus, governed as Caesars, destined to succeed their Augusti. The empire, fractured for so long, now stood with 4 centers of power, 4 armies, and a system designed to prevent the chaos of civil war. Diocletian also reformed the empire's inner workings. He restructured provinces, strengthened borders, reorganized the army into mobile field units and frontier garrisons. He fixed prices, issued edicts, and tried to stabilize a shattered economy. His rule was stern, authoritarian, and absolute, reflecting the new reality of Rome. The old illusions of the Republic were gone. The emperor was no longer princeps, first among equals, but dominus, lord and master. But perhaps the most infamous aspect of Diocletian's reign was his persecution of Christians. This new faith, once a small sect, had spread across the empire, drawing converts from every class and province. Christians refused to sacrifice to the traditional gods, undermining the rituals that Romans believed bound their state to divine favor. To Diocletian and his colleagues, this defiance was treason. In 303, he unleashed the Great Persecution, ordering churches burned, scriptures destroyed, and Christians imprisoned or executed. For 8 years, the empire was bathed in blood, yet the faith endured, growing stronger in the face of martyrdom. When Diocletian, weary of power, did what no emperor before him had done and abdicated in 305, the system he built soon faltered. Civil wars erupted once more, rivals clashing for supremacy. Amid the chaos rose the son of Constantius Chlorus, Constantine. Constantine was a soldier of iron will, a shrewd statesman, and perhaps the most consequential emperor since Augustus. In 312, he marched against his rival Maxentius, who held Rome itself. At the Milvian Bridge, the 2 armies met. The night before the battle, Constantine is said to have seen a vision, a cross of light in the sky with the words, In hoc signo vinces. In this sign, conquer. He ordered his men to mark their shields with the Christian symbol, and the next day, he triumphed. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, and Constantine entered Rome as master of the West. From that moment, Christianity and empire were bound together. In 313, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance and ending centuries of persecution. Churches were built, bishops gained influence, and the once persecuted faith now had imperial favor. Constantine himself embraced Christianity, though he retained pagan titles, a man straddling two worlds. His reign transformed the empire. In 324, he defeated his last rival Licinius and reunited Rome under a single ruler. To secure his power, he founded a new capital, Constantinople, on the site of Byzantium, a city of marble palaces, soaring churches, and impregnable walls. It was a new Rome for a new age, strategically placed between Europe and Asia, destined to endure long after the old city had fallen. Constantine also reshaped the church itself. In 325, he convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the empire to settle disputes of doctrine. The result was the Nicene Creed, a declaration of faith that would define Christianity for centuries. The emperor now stood not only as ruler of men but as guardian of the church, wielding spiritual as well as temporal authority. When Constantine died in 337, he was baptized a Christian, the first emperor to enter the faith officially. His reign marked a turning point, and the empire was no longer the domain of Jupiter and Mars but of Christ. Yet the unity Constantine forged did not last. His sons divided the empire, quarreling and spilling blood. The 4th century was marked by both revival and strife. Emperors like Constantius II and Theodosius the Great struggled to maintain order, while waves of barbarian tribes pressed ever harder at the frontiers. The Persians remained a constant threat in the east, while Goths, Vandals, and Huns gathered on the Danube and Rhine. Religious conflict, too, grew sharper. Though Constantine had sought unity, disputes over Christ's nature divided the church, spawning heresies and councils. Paganism lingered, though its days were numbered. In 380, under Theodosius, Christianity became the official religion of the empire, and pagan temples were shuttered. The old gods of Rome, who had guarded her since the days of Romulus, were finally abandoned. Theodosius would also be the last man to rule both East and West together. Upon his death in 395, the empire was divided permanently between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. What had once been a single empire was now two unequal halves, the East wealthy, urban, and resilient, the West fragile, rural, and exposed. From this division flowed the fate of Rome. In the centuries to come, the Western Empire would stagger under the weight of invasion and collapse, while the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine, would endure for 1,000 years more. The transformation begun by Diocletian and Constantine was complete. The Rome of Augustus was gone, replaced by a Christian empire split between two worlds, bound by faith yet divided by destiny. The death of Theodosius in 395 left the empire divided forever. His sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, inherited realms already strained by internal decay and external threats. The Western Empire, vast and thinly defended, struggled under weak emperors, corrupt officials, and restless armies. Rome, once mistress of the world, became a city of anxiety, its walls standing tall, but its authority shrinking with each passing year. Across the borders, tribes stirred. The Visigoths, once allies of Rome, grew restless under pressure from the Huns sweeping from the steppes of Central Asia. Their king, Alaric, understood both the might and the weakness of Rome. In 410, he marched upon the city itself, a shock that reverberated through the ancient world. Rome had not fallen in centuries, and now, for the first time in nearly 800 years, it was sacked. The streets ran with fire and pillage, temples and homes desecrated, citizens fleeing in terror. Yet Alaric, aware of the city's significance, spared much of its population, taking gold and grain, but leaving Rome alive, a symbolic victory as much as a material one. In the decades that followed, the Western Empire staggered from crisis to crisis. The Vandals, seaborne and merciless, swept across North Africa, capturing Carthage and seizing Rome's grain supply. In 455, under King Genseric, they entered the city, looting and burning, while the Western emperors, weak and impotent, could do little. These invasions, combined with internal strife, eroded the authority of the imperial office. Emperors were installed and deposed by generals, often children or figureheads who could not command loyalty beyond a single army. Among the most infamous of the empire's enemies were the Huns, led by Attila, whose terror stretched from the Danube to the Rhine. He struck at Gaul and Italy alike, leaving devastation in his wake. Though he was turned back at the Catalonian plains in 451, the empire's inability to repel him without reliance on federated allies exposed its vulnerability. Rome no longer had the resources, the manpower, or the unity that had once crushed Hannibal and subdued the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, the Western court became a puppet theater, dominated by powerful generals like Ricimer, who ruled in all but name. Emperors were raised and toppled like pawns on a chessboard. In 476, the final act unfolded. Romulus Augustulus, a boy of 16, sat on the throne. He was emperor in title only, powerless to defend the city or command loyalty. That year, Odoacer, a Germanic general commanding Roman legions, deposed him. Romulus was spared, sent into quiet exile, and the line of Western emperors ended. The Western Empire had fallen not in a single cataclysm, but through decades of decay, mismanagement, invasions, and the relentless pressure of history. Cities crumbled, trade declined, armies were unreliable, and the very identity of Rome shifted. Yet this was not the end of the Roman story, for in the East, Constantinople endured. The Eastern Empire, wealthy, fortified, and culturally vibrant, continued the legacy of Rome, preserving law, administration, and civilization for centuries to come. The fall of the West was not merely political, it was cultural, social, and spiritual. Pagan temples fell silent. The Latin language persisted in fragmented forms. Christianity grew as a unifying force, and a new Europe began to emerge from the ruins. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman authority, Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks, would adopt Roman laws, architecture, and governance, carrying the Roman imprint into the Middle Ages. By 476, the world of Roman dominion had shifted dramatically. The Eternal City, once the heart of a vast empire, was now a symbol of memory, a city of ghosts and echoes. Yet the East endured. Constantinople, the new Rome, remained, its walls impregnable, its emperors powerful, its legacy of administration, culture, and military might continuing for another 1,000 years. The Western Empire had fallen, but Rome, in spirit and influence, would never truly die. While the West had fallen into chaos, the Eastern Empire endured. Constantinople, perched on the Bosporus, was a city of walls and waterways, golden domes and bustling markets, a crossroads of continents and cultures. Here, Roman law, military discipline, and administrative skill survived intact. The emperors of the East, heirs to Augustus and Constantine, wielded power with an authority both absolute and sacred, blending Roman governance with a new Christian worldview. The early decades were a struggle to consolidate power, repel invasions, and maintain the integrity of the empire. Emperor Zeno faced the Ostrogoths and other barbarian groups pressing from the Balkans, while the Persians threatened the eastern frontier. Yet Constantinople's massive walls, its chain across the Golden Horn, and its skillful diplomacy allowed the city to endure where Rome had fallen. By the reign of Justinian the Firm in the 6th century, the empire reached a pinnacle of ambition. Justinian, ruling from 527 to 565, sought to restore the glory of Rome itself. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, reconquered Italy from the Ostrogoths, subdued the Vandals in North Africa, and brought portions of Spain back under imperial control. For a fleeting moment it seemed that Rome's unity, lost in the West, might be reborn. Justinian's reign was also marked by culture and law. He commissioned the Hagia Sophia, a dome that soared above Constantinople, symbolizing divine majesty and imperial power. And in law he codified centuries of Roman legislation in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Justinian Code, creating a legal foundation that would influence Europe for a millennium. Yet Justinian's ambitions were costly. Wars drained the treasury, plague swept the empire, and rebellions like the Nika riots threatened Constantinople itself. Still, the empire endured, its structures more resilient than Rome had ever been. After Justinian, the Byzantine Empire faced cycles of crisis and revival. The 7th and 8th centuries saw the rise of Islam, which swept across the Middle East and North Africa, stripping Byzantium of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. Yet the empire adapted. Emperors fortified Constantinople, reorganized armies, and embraced Greek fire, a legendary incendiary weapon that would defend the city for centuries. Iconoclasm, the controversial policy of destroying religious images, divided society and church alike, leaving scars but also reshaping Byzantine identity. By the 9th and 10th centuries, the empire experienced resurgence. Leaders like Basil the Pharaon and Basil Than expanded borders, secured trade routes, and reinforced imperial authority. Basil the Coup, known as the Bulgar Slayer, crushed the Bulgars, extending Byzantine influence deep into the Balkans. Constantinople remained the jewel of the East, a city of marble, mosaics, and immense wealth. Markets teemed with silk, spices, and gold, and the emperor ruled not only as sovereign but as a living representative of divine order. Trade, diplomacy, and culture flowed outward. Byzantine influence extended across Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. Scholars preserved classical texts, copying manuscripts that would one day fuel the Renaissance. Artists and architects produced works of dazzling sophistication, blending Roman, Greek, and Christian motifs. And the Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople, became a unifying force for the empire, binding people together across diverse lands. Yet the empire's survival was precarious. Waves of enemies, Arabs, Rus, Seljuk Turks, Normans, and Crusaders, tested its strength. The empire's wealth, its position at the crossroads of continents, made it both a prize and a target. Still, the Byzantines endured, their bureaucracy, army, and diplomacy keeping the empire alive when the Western Empire had perished. By the late 12th century, Byzantium had become both a beacon of civilization and a fragile fortress of power. Internal divisions, court intrigue, and economic strain weakened the empire even as it dazzled the world with its grandeur. And in 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, the unthinkable happened. Latin crusaders who had once claimed to defend Christendom sacked Constantinople. The city's treasures were plundered, the Hagia Sophia desecrated, and Byzantine authority fragmented into successor states. Yet even in defeat, the Byzantine spirit survived. Exiled emperors established courts in Nicaea and Trebizond, preserving Roman law, traditions, and hopes of restoration. Constantinople itself would be reclaimed in 1261 by Michael VIII Palaiologos, demonstrating the resilience and endurance of the Roman legacy in the East. Byzantium, Rome reborn, became a bridge between antiquity and the medieval world. Its emperors claimed the title of Roman Augustus, its citizens saw themselves as Romans, and its culture preserved the memory, law, and artistry of the ancient empire. The story of Rome had not ended with the fall of the West. It had transformed, enduring in a city of walls, gold, and faith for nearly a millennium after Rome's original glory had faded. When Michael VIII Palaiologos recaptured Constantinople in 1261, it was a moment of triumph and nostalgia. The city, scarred by the Latin occupation, rose once more as the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire. Marble and mosaics were repaired, churches reopened, and imperial authority was restored. Yet the empire Michael inherited was a shadow of its former self. Its territory was limited to parts of Greece, the Balkans, and western Anatolia. Wealth and manpower had dwindled, while threats, both internal and external, loomed ever larger. Over the next century, Byzantium struggled to survive. The empire was a patchwork of fiefs and city-states, constantly contested by the rising powers around it. The Serbs in the Balkans, the Bulgarians to the north, and the Ottomans in Anatolia threatened to overwhelm what remained of imperial authority. Even within Constantinople, factions of aristocrats and bureaucracy vied for influence, weakening governance and stifling reform. The Ottomans, a new force in the region, gradually tightened their grip. Emerging from Anatolia, they conquered city after city, absorbing Byzantine territories with methodical efficiency. By the 15th century, the empire had shrunk to little more than Constantinople, Thessalonica, and scattered outposts along the Aegean coast. The once mighty Eastern Roman Empire was now a fortress city under siege, a jewel of civilization encircled by enemies. Inside Constantinople, life persisted with remarkable vibrancy despite the threats. Markets thrived with silk, spices, and imported goods. Scholars continued to copy classical manuscripts, preserving the knowledge of antiquity. Artists created mosaics, frescoes, and icons that rivaled the splendor of Justinian's era. Yet even the beauty of the city could not hide its vulnerability. Its walls, legendary and formidable, were tested repeatedly. The empire's population had dwindled, the treasury was exhausted, and the military could no longer match the organized and relentless power of the Ottoman forces. In 1453, the moment that had been feared for decades arrived. Sultan Mehmed II, the young and ambitious leader of the Ottoman Turks, laid siege to Constantinople. His armies encircled the city, equipped with massive cannons capable of breaching even the most ancient walls. For weeks, the defenders, led by Emperor Constantine XV Palaiologos, held firm, repelling attack after attack, fighting with the courage of centuries of Roman soldiers. Civilians, soldiers, and clerics labored side by side, manning the walls, pouring boiling oil and hurling stones. But the Ottomans were relentless. On May 29, 1453, after 53 days of siege, their cannons tore through the Theodosian walls. Soldiers poured into the city, overwhelming the defenders. Constantine V fought bravely, reportedly dying in the fray, the last Roman emperor falling on the steps of his capital. The city that had stood for over 1,000 years, that had witnessed the crowning of emperors, the triumph of Justinian, the brilliance of the Macedonian and Comnenian dynasties, was conquered. The fall of Constantinople marked not just the end of the Byzantine Empire, but the final chapter of the Roman Empire itself. The Eastern Roman state, which had survived the collapse of the West by centuries, was gone. Its institutions, its laws, and its traditions would live on in exile, in scholars who fled to the West and in the Orthodox Church. The Hagia Sophia, the city's greatest architectural wonder, was converted into a mosque, symbolizing both continuity and transformation. Yet even in defeat, Rome's legacy endured. Byzantine art, law, and learning influenced the Renaissance in Italy. The memory of Roman governance inspired European powers, while the notion of an empire united under a single authority endured in political imagination. From Romulus and Remus to Constantinople, from the legions of Augustus to the walls of Theodosius, the story of Rome had spanned over 15 centuries. A story of conquest, transformation, faith, and resilience. The Eternal City, first in Italy, then reborn in Constantinople, had endured countless trials, adapted to countless challenges, and inspired the world in ways unmatched by any other civilization. Rome was gone, yet it remained alive in memory, culture, and law, a civilization whose influence would echo forever. And so the Roman Empire in all its forms, Republic, Empire, Western Dominion, and Byzantine continuity, came to its final conclusion, leaving a legacy that would shape Europe, the Mediterranean, and the wider world for millennia to come.